network of experts of some 800 people that are all standing on the front edge and the front line against transnational organized crime in the illicit economies. This webinar for us is an opportunity to try and showcase the expertise that we have available to understand and interpret recent events and the impact that illicit economies have had on them and the impact that recent events will have on the illicit economy itself. I would like to now just introduce my co-host for the webinar, Syria.
Thank you. I am Syria Gastelum Felix. I am Resilience Director at the Global Initiative. And before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. This event offers simultaneous interpretation, and you can select your preferred language, English or Espanol, using the interpretation function at the bottom of your screen. You can use also the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we're going to be looking at them throughout the webinar and address them towards the end of the session. So let's begin.
Thank you so much. We thought rather than go into recent events, we would kick off with a short recap of the place we're in today. So my colleagues will just play that video now.
Flying low over the city of Caracas, US Special Forces breached the presidential compound and seized Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, who were swiftly extracted and airlifted to a US Navy ship in the Caribbean before being flown to the headquarters of the Drug Enforcement Administration in New York. Maduro was wanted by the US for a slew of charges, including narco-terrorism and conspiracy to import cocaine. President Trump publicly announced Maduro's capture, framing Operation Absolute Resolve as a law enforcement action with the aim of arresting Maduro on drug trafficking and weapons-related charges. On the 5th of January, Maduro and his wife were arraigned in a New York court where they pleaded not guilty to federal drug trafficking charges and attempted to challenge being brought to the US against their will. The foundations of this charge had been laid months, if not years, prior.
They have obtained the support of the Maduro regime, who is allowing them to use Venezuela as a safe haven from which they can continue to conduct their cocaine trafficking.
At the start of his second term, President Trump signed an executive order which designated 8 organized criminal groups as foreign terrorist organizations, including Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua.
They were sent by Maduro to terrorize our people, and now Maduro will never again be able to threaten an American citizen.
In August, the Trump administration increased the reward on offer for Maduro's capture to $50 million, doubling the reward money offered under former President Joe Biden, after which the US began to progressively build up military strength in the Caribbean. On the 2nd of September 2025, US forces carried out the first known strike on a boat alleged to be carrying illicit drugs off the coast of Venezuela. It was the first in a wave of US strikes on vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, targeting alleged narco-terrorists. Reports suggest that more than 100 people have been killed in the strikes over the last 4 months of 2025. Then on the 3rd of January 2026, the United States military carried out a coordinated airstrike against multiple targets in Venezuela, including military facilities and airfields around Caracas. Early that morning, explosions were heard across the capital, and it was reported that at least 75 people were killed by the US strikes. US President Donald Trump described the strikes as part of an operation to dismantle narcotics trafficking infrastructure and apprehend Maduro. In the 2 weeks following Maduro's extraction, President Trump said this:
"We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition."
Though at the same time, Vice President of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, was sworn in as interim president, and both her administration and the US have committed to working together despite some strong rhetoric on both sides.
No, but she's cooperating.
And the president seems to have turned his attention towards securing access to Venezuela's oil production, which some have suggested was the main target of the entire operation. The future for Venezuela and the US's genuine intentions or commitment to combating drug trafficking in the region is impossible to know. But one thing is certain. For the underworld of the global illicit economy, the events of this year have substantially changed the operating environment, and there will be ramifications.
This latest chapter in Venezuela began with a familiar frame, the war on drugs. But then it shifted again towards narco-terrorism, then to security threats, and securing the country's oil resources. And somewhere along the way, the story on organized crime itself became again blurred inside the broader geopolitical crisis. But organized crime in Latin America is a real significant problem. And over the last decade, Venezuela has been an important vector and in more criminal markets than just drugs. Venezuela has established itself as a key hub for criminal activity in the continent, where economic crisis, forced migration, and institutional weakening have encouraged the expansion of multiple illicit markets. The country operates as a source, transit point, and facilitator for activities such as human trafficking, drug trafficking, and illegal mining, coordinated by local and transnational networks. Today, we want to bring that story back into focus because this is also a story about organized crime disruption, and the consequences will reach far beyond Venezuela's borders. Tuesday.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all the people that we have here for the webinar. We have a big crowd in that we asked all of our global initiative regional heads and directors for our observatories in Latin America to be here to share their research and expertise and key findings and to respond to any questions that you have at the end of the webinar. So very quickly, to rudely introduce the GI team first, we have Cecilia Farfan Mendez, the head of our North America Observatory, Romain Lecoeur-Grandmaison, the head of our Haiti and the Caribbean Observatory, Gabriel Fenari, the head of the Amazon Basin Observatory, and last but by no means least, Felipe Botero, who is the director of our observatory for the Andean region. But I will take a breath and introduce with a little bit more our three special guests. So as I mentioned, we have a network of experts. These are people who work at the in their day jobs and as both researchers, analysts, and first responders to issues of organized crime in the illicit economy. We have invited Clabel Rangel, a Venezuelan journalist and part of one of our first fellowship cohorts for our GI Resilience Fund. She has done an extraordinary amount of investigations and reporting in Venezuela and across the region, and is the co-founder of a regional journalism network known as Red Amazonia. We're also super pleased to introduce Rebecca Hansen, who is a professor at the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Florida and herself leads an institute that looks at regional instability and governance and has an enormous amount of research in Venezuela itself. And finally, Eduardo Bechara Gomez, a researcher and lecturer at the Universidad Externa de Colombia, my apologies for my accent, and who has been looking at cross-border dynamics, instability, and drivers of violence on the Colombia-Venezuela border. We will be asking all of them to engage in this conversation, to provide their perspectives. There is a lot that is unknown realistically in the context of Venezuela, and there is always a lot that is unknown in the context of an illicit economy. So we will be triangulating knowledge and experience to try and present to you the best of the evidence that we can. So thank you everybody for joining us. As Syria said in the beginning, we do want to make this as interactive as we can. So please do put questions that you have for any of our experts or more generally into the chat as we go along, and we will try and deal with those both as part of the scripted conversations and in a dedicated Q&A at the end. So let's begin. We really wanted to move beyond the headlines, beyond what the US media has to say and what has so far been reported and the way that the conversation evolved, to go look a little bit deeper than the labels and think about actually how power works in Venezuela today and what impact that has on the criminal economy. And we're going to start with directing our first question to Rebecca. We know that in the indictment and in a lot of the press prior to the extraction of Maduro, Maduro had been accused of being the head of a cartel that they called Cartel de los Soles, and now he's gone. So, in your assessment, of course, how real was that claim? What veracity should we give to it? And what impact is his removal going to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think Maduro's removal is going to have a lot of impacts, but not because he was the head of this organization, the Cartel de los Soles. I mean, I think it's the veracity of that claim has come into question just in the most recent indictment, where the United States decided to almost completely remove any claims about Maduro's linkage to that group, because first, there's not really any evidence of it, and secondly, it's a poor understanding of what that term is. So the term Cartel de los Soles is a term that really started to be used by journalists, probably around the 1990s, to refer to the fact that the military was very corrupt, was involved in illicit activities, right? So the concept itself, the name itself actually emerges before Chavez comes into office. So if this group did exist, it would have pre-existed Chavez. But journalists really use this as a term to refer to the fact that, look, the military are engaged in illicit activities and corruption. And we know that under Maduro, that has increased significantly, right? So it is absolutely the case that there is much more drug trafficking, much more illicit activities in the country now than what existed before Chavismo, right? I mean, I think there's a similar issue here. A lot of people referred to Venezuela as a narco state, and I understand why people use this term. Venezuelan state officials are really involved up to their eyeballs in criminal economies. But I think this concept really ends up muddying the waters because it paints an inaccurate portrait of how criminal markets are organized in the country, right? So again, it's of course the case that military officers are engaged in drug trafficking, but so are many other armed and criminal actors that sometimes coordinate with each other and are oftentimes in conflict with each other, right? The government doesn't have anything close to a monopoly on drug trafficking, which I think is what the term narco state would indicate, right? Even if it is the biggest and most important player. And there's not really any single centralized command structure to drug trafficking in the entire country, right? Instead, what we see is that military officers tend to run their own kind of regional outfits to control different types of illicit economies, right? Sometimes these regional outfits are coordinated with others, and sometimes they aren't, right? So, again, I think the lack of evidence of a lot of this stuff is going to start to play out in court proceedings in the next few months or years, however long it takes, right? Because much of what the US's narrative about what criminal markets look like in Venezuela has even been contradicted by its own security agencies, right? So one of the main justifications that Trump has used to deport Venezuelans out, from the United States and has used to justify bombings in the Caribbean and now this invasion, is that Maduro runs the organization Tren de Aragua, right? Or that Maduro has sent members of Tren de Aragua to the United States to kind of destabilize the country. And this is just, again, a really poor misunderstanding of how relationships between the government and criminal groups work. Again, there are absolutely relationships between the Maduro government and criminal organizations, but these tend to be very fragile. They tend to be oriented around, shared economic interests, but it's not the case that Maduro was the head of this organized, centralized criminal organization, right? Instead, what we're talking about are a lot of various criminal groups that the government is a part of and relates, and connects with and works with, but also competes with, right? And so I'll just kind of close with this. I think this is very obvious in what's happened with Tren de Aragua in Venezuela over the past few years, right? So Tren de Aragua became a very powerful and important criminal organization in Venezuela for a number of years. They still are, but are less so because the Maduro government invaded the prison that they were based out of, right? And that really did impact their organizational capacity. So it's, I think this is a good indication that we have criminal organizations in the country that have grown much more powerful, much more consolidated, but then also oftentimes go toe to toe with the Maduro administration. So I think, I guess like the summary of all that is like, it's much messier on the ground. And actually there'll be a lot less violence in Venezuela, I think, if we were talking about one large organization that ran drug trafficking or illicit markets in Venezuela, right? One of the reasons why we see so much violence is because there's so much competition, there's so much fragmentation, and there's so many groups.
Thank you, Rebecca. And this is what we think, that labels matter because of this confusion and what creates. Felipe, you have also been studying the evolution of Venezuela crime. How did it get to this point in organized crime, in the organized ecosystem of the continent? Do you agree that narco state is a fit label for Venezuela? And why do these labels matter?
Thank you, Siria. Y creo que voy a cambiar a español, si es posible, voy a dar mi respuesta en español. Si alguien no está entendiendo, me hace señas y cambiamos a inglés, pero vamos a aprovechar la aproximación regional. Yo quiero llamar la atención y comparto mucho lo que acaba de decir Rebeca, sobre todo a dos resultados que podemos evidenciar en nuestro índice global de crimen organizado. Y es la puntuación que ha tenido en las tres versiones Venezuela, tanto en actores integrados al Estado, que son estos actores que operan o que funcionan como grupos criminales desde adentro del Estado, y por otra parte, los grupos de tipo mafioso. Venezuela se rankea séptimo a nivel global dentro de los países con mayor clasificación o como una mayor puntuación en términos de la incidencia que tienen los grupos integrados al Estado. Y se puede rankear de segundo dentro de los grupos de estilo mafioso. En ese orden de ideas, lo que vemos en Venezuela, y como ya lo explicaba Rebeca, es un país donde si bien no hay un solo actor que controle y que tiene un monopolio, tiene una incidencia muy fuerte de distintos grupos de tipo mafioso, tanto locales como extranjeros, porque Venezuela no solamente está operando Tren de Aragua, que lo mencionaba Rebeca, sino que tiene una presencia muy fuerte, el ELN, quien incluso algunos autores lo mencionan como un grupo paramilitar en el caso venezolano, o un grupo binacional que opera entre Colombia y Venezuela. Y también están las disidencias de las FARC y también sabemos que hay incidencia de grupos brasileños. Pero estos grupos de tipo mafioso muy fuertes y muy presentes operan también en un contexto de altísima cooptación del Estado y donde hay distintos actores del Estado, no solo del Ejecutivo, sino también de las fuerzas militares, sino también del sistema judicial, que tienen acuerdos que pueden verse a nivel regional o en mercados criminales específicos, porque en Venezuela no solamente hay dinámicas de tráfico de cocaína, sino que también tenemos tráfico de migrantes, trata de personas y un mercado criminal que es fundamental a considerar, que es el de la minería ilegal de oro. Entonces, en este contexto, creo que no solamente comparto la aproximación de Rebeca, sino que entendemos que el sistema o el ecosistema criminal en Venezuela funciona por una validación o por un trabajo compartido entre estos dos tipos de actores. Actores de tipo mafioso fuertes y presentes que trabajan con el beneplácito y con la funcionalidad que permiten una serie de actores integrados al Estado. Ya que podamos entender estos como un solo actor o que estos dependieran solamente de Maduro, creo que es una lectura corta. Sin embargo, y también creo que es importante explicarlo, haber removido la figura de Maduro, quien había logrado generar un equilibrio entre este ecosistema complejo, seguramente va a generar disrupciones.
Thanks, Felipe. That was great. I mean, there are two lines of issues we want to bring out from your comments, but I'd like to start first, if we could, looking more at this issue of mafia groups. So, or, the dynamics between mafia groups and controllers. I'm sure many of you who are here today know that the GI publishes a global organized crime index. That index does a ranking of 5 types of criminal actors. And it was super interesting in the Venezuela profile that we released in November this year, that in the hierarchy of the 5, state-embedded actors, so where you would imagine, for example, the kind of infrastructure that Rebecca described, linked to the highest levels of the state, had a very high score, one of the highest in the world, but actually higher was the ranking for mafia-style actors, which was, again, one of the highest in the world. So we saw a score of 9 and a score of 9.5. I'd like to ask Clavel, we saw a lot of this kind of people on the streets, groups of armed militias. Is that for you what Felipe was describing? Are they criminal? And what does that mean actually for the people who live in Venezuela?
Okay, let me try to do this in English, or then I can switch to Spanish as Felipe did. I think, as like Felipe described, it's true. It's different groups operating in Venezuela, and depend of the region, they are changing, and they are only, in many cases, they are operating because there is a state tolerance in that territory, in many cases. And my view is, especially in the south of Venezuela, in the Venezuelan Amazon, where different groups have control of some mines on the border with Colombia or with Brazil. So I think pictures that you have seen this last week is more in Caracas, that these groups also have some connection with some people in power. As you may know, the Diosdado Cabello, that is control the police, political police in Venezuela, and some groups linked to. But that's not mean that this group obey completely to the power, because they have been gaining some kind of more power in the last years. So you can see, for example, in the Venezuelan Amazon, some groups that have changed, and I want to say also that is changed this in the last years. This is a situation that changed like almost monthly, that different groups operating some mine, and then they were displaced by another group that with the tolerance of the states, and they were replaced by military, or they were replaced by ELN, or in some case they just moved. And I was talking about with some sources this week about how is the situation in the south, and he told me like this is right now is total calm. This group, the collective in the south of Venezuela, for example, in the gold mines, just call people to stay in calm. We don't have any kind of violence, and if you know the consequences, if you go to the street or if you go to protest in the street. So this is kind of control that they just operate, and this is a dynamic that we started seeing mostly last year after the elections, the election in 2024. When these groups, they were changing, but they were called to say like an agreement of peace, just if you control the political situation in your regions. So there was the situation. That is another dynamics there. The economic crisis inside Venezuela, the gold prices, how the different groups have been changing in the last years, but they have been operating because the state, some people in the state allow them to operate in that region. And this is a many factors. It's not just Maduro, it's just Al Cabello, it's the military forces and different generals that they have companies also inside in the Venezuelan Amazon. So it's a multi-factor system, and different people with different kind of business and economies, criminal economies linked to this territory. Specifically, I'm talking about the Venezuelan Amazon.
Thank you, Clavel, and please never apologize for your English, because it's certainly a hell of a lot better than my Spanish.
I'm learning.
And comes across very clear. I'm going to ask Cecilia, because I mean, what Clavel is described as this complex ecosystem of different actors, which has fundamentally been simplified in this extradition to removing Maduro. It's not the first time we've seen this kind of kingpin strategy towards criminal groups in Latin America, pick off the top one and then hope it all goes away. I think we have some lessons on this. What would you say, I guess, on how likely this is to be effective, given the interplays that both Rebecca, Clavel, and Felipe have described?
Thank you, Tuesday. I think in general, the concern is that decades of evidence from Latin America, as you point out, precisely show that this idea that you can remove an alleged head and that's going to weaken or effectively disappear an organization is not actually what happens. And the kingpin strategy, in fact, generates more violence because you tend to destabilize existing arrangements precisely of how criminal markets operate. And so what we see is that they tend to generate more violence, and also criminal organizations over time have adapted to respond to the kingpin strategy. And so we see much more flatter structures. We don't necessarily see that everyone knows what's happening within the organization, such that the removal of someone within the group is not going to completely weaken the organization. So what policy has, or the proposed policy, that rather than focusing on alleged kingpin that symbolically could be and make headlines, is that if you really want to weaken these structures, and to the points that Rebecca, Clavel, and Felipe were making, you ought to remove these management structures, and you would want to have an operation, for instance, that goes after many people at the managerial level at the same time, similar to operations against organized crime that we see in European context. And so the concern is, again, that while symbolically it can mean a lot, especially to some law enforcement organizations, we know that the kingpin strategy tends to produce more violence and does not eliminate the criminal market that it seeks to eliminate.
Okay, Cecilia, I have a follow-up question for you, because in this scenario, is a lot of the questions that have been coming about is with the recent case of Honduras President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was extradited and then convicted for similar things, but then what I wanted to ask is that the GI has any evidence that, because he was pardoned, so do we have any evidence on these accusations, and what are the similarities that we're seeing now that, we have, again, another Latin American president in a US prison?
And if I can tack another question just to make your life more difficult.
Sure.
I mean, what do we know actually about the US's record in prosecuting drug traffickers from Latin America, whether they're presidents or not?
So I would say, to your very simple questions, let me try to summarize it in this way. There's a long history of prosecuting high-level criminals from Latin America in the US. I think over time, extradition, 30 years ago, I think extradition was seen as a process that involved justice, and essentially having someone extradited to the US sort of punctuating that justice process. I think now, increasingly, we see demands from the country saying that extraditing people, especially from civil society, is not necessarily providing justice in this context. And our colleagues at Elementa, for instance, have been very vocal about this, and they have even a project that's called Extraditing Justice, meaning that if you don't prosecute these criminals in the country where they have committed crimes, in addition to the US, are you really delivering justice? So there's that open-ended question there. I think in the case of the Honduran president, what we see is an answer from the Trump administration calling what the Biden administration did as an over-prosecution. It will be interesting to see, as the Maduro trial, if it gets to that, advances, if there's going to be also arguments around if this is an over-prosecution. But I think these two cases at least spotlight two things. One is that over time, we have lost our ability to have access to the evidence. One thing that has changed in US courts is that evidence that was presented in cases, 40, 30 years ago is no longer accessible. One of the arguments that law enforcement makes is that criminal groups learn from this. They learn how law enforcement learn about their activities, and they don't want to reveal how is it that they found out about this information. So we may know some of the facts, but we don't necessarily know the details of the how the investigation was carried out, like we used to have access to, again, 40, 30 years ago. The other thing is that with these cases, again, it will be interesting to see how different countries react, and especially because not everyone recognizes the terrorist designation. And so just to underscore that the terrorism designation is seen by some countries as a unilateral measure by the US. Some countries may agree with this designation, other countries may not agree with this, but this is not an international designation of terrorists. This is something that the US has decided they're going to call certain organizations and certain individuals terrorists. And I'll stop there so we can continue our conversation.
Thank you, Cecilia. And in our intro video said that Maduro's extraction would actually substantially change the operating environment for organized crime in the region. So let's talk more about that and borders and illicit markets. And to help us make sense of that disruption, I will want to turn to Eduardo Bechara. Eduardo, in your research, you focus on armed conflict, security responses, and the Colombia-Venezuela border. What have you been hearing about Colombia too as part of this evolving story? And what is happening in the border right now?
Well, Colombia and Venezuela are uneasy neighbors along a very troubled border. So what I would like to make a central claim is that this troubled border share between Colombia and Venezuela requires cooperation efforts on behalf of both governments. So you may easily think that the best solution for dealing with all the criminal markets in the border, in the transborder region, will be cooperation in matter of security affairs, involving security apparatus from Colombia and from Venezuela working together. But also there is the issue of the peace efforts of Colombia, in which Venezuela has always been a very relevant actor. So I would like to place this on a broader perspective, because it's very interesting to see that Venezuela has been present as a key actor in Colombian peace processes before Hugo Chavez came to power. So in 1991, for instance, Caracas, the Venezuelan capital, hosted a series of peace talks with the Coordinadora Guerrillera, Simón Bolívar, which was sort to say like a coalition of many rebel groups in Colombia, very alike as the Frente Faraón de Martí para la Liberación Nacional in El Salvador. And later, while Hugo Chavez was in power, basically Venezuela during the Santos Calderon government and the FARC-EP process with the FARC-EP played the role of país garante of the peace process. And also with Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela has a special seat with the ELN and also one of the disidencias of the FARC-EP in these multiple tracks of the Paz Total. So what is my point here, and it's very interesting because I think that as my colleague from the University of Florida mentioned, if we broaden our perspective, we see that there are certain patterns who are not, during just only Chavez being in power or Nicolás Maduro being in power. But my point here is that Colombia and Venezuela have tried through the Colombian peace process, and Venezuela entering the peace process in Colombia, trying to solve the security situation. And on the other hand, let's say that you will think that you need cooperation between security apparatus of the states. And that is precisely like a very controversial topic between Colombia and Venezuela, because Colombia and Venezuela basically have repeatedly closing their borders, opening their borders, which is easy to say if you are in Bogota and in Caracas, that says like, I'm going to close the window because I'm getting too much noise. But what you see in the border is like nothing is closed, nothing is open. It's a very porous border, and it's controlled a lot by armed actors in each side of the border. So what is interesting is what happens now with Maduro being removed from power and Daisy Rodriguez, who seemed very pragmatic, being as the interim president. What will be the role of Venezuela in Colombia's peace process? Will there be like a fundamental change? And what will be the main goal of Venezuela in participating in Colombia's peace processes? Because back in the day, before Hugo Chavez and during Hugo Chavez, it was clear that there was a need to contain the transnational dimension of Colombia's armed conflict. And by that goal, securing the border, bringing safety to the border. And with Nicolás Maduro, I do think that changed. I think that because of what my colleague Felipe Botero mentioned, first of all, on the Venezuelan side, the borders between what is the statehood and criminal actors became quite blurry. And also the ELN is way far more complex. So in terms of the border, what should we expect? Just to mention briefly some key points. I do think that there is like some implication in terms of the peace efforts with the ELN and with one of the FARC dissidents groups. That I was looking, for instance, at official statements of the Palacio de Miraflores and of the Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores de Venezuela. And of course, Colombia is not mentioned in any of them. It's just the relationship between Caracas and Washington, who is at the center of the discussion. And also what we must expect also is in terms of one of the biggest like humanitarian crisis of the hemisphere, as is the exodus of Venezuelan people, who perhaps many fear that this will, by fear of, I don't know, reprisals domestically in Venezuela, many Venezuelans will start, you know, again, coming to Colombia.
Yes, and I want to stay in Colombia. Entonces, voy contigo otra vez, Felipe. I'm going to go back to you because Donald Trump is apparently, you know, rallying against Colombia, and there's been also this diplomatic element to this. Is it true that transition in Venezuela and the reconstruction of the country depends on cooperation and involvement with Colombia? How these two countries enmesh in this peace process or pacification, as we can call it now?
Gracias, Siria. Yo siento que en este momento tenemos más incertidumbre que certezas. Lo que sabíamos al momento de la extracción y de la captura de Nicolás Maduro era que había también una tensión diplomática y política muy fuerte de parte del gobierno de Donald Trump con el gobierno de Gustavo Petro. Sin embargo, hemos visto también y una tensión muy marcada alrededor de la narrativa o el discurso de la guerra contra las drogas y de los incumplimientos de Colombia y de la desertificación que tuvo Colombia por parte del gobierno de los Estados Unidos, y un poco, digamos, ha venido escalando una narrativa del incumplimiento por parte del gobierno de Gustavo Petro a los acuerdos y a las expectativas que tienen los Estados Unidos en materia de lucha contra las drogas, específicamente del tráfico de cocaína. Después de la captura hemos visto también unos movimientos interesantes en materia política internacional del lado colombiano, con unos acercamientos entre Petro y Trump, con una citación a la Comisión de Relaciones Exteriores en Colombia que trae al resto de expresidentes y un poco a llamar la atención a tomarse en serio la relación bilateral con los Estados Unidos, ¿no? Hay como una idea de amenaza después de lo que pasa en Venezuela y por ende también una respuesta política y diplomática más consensuada que lo que habíamos visto en los últimos meses, que estaba muy mediado por trinos por parte del presidente Petro del lado colombiano. Ahora, si la transición va a depender de la cooperación por Colombia, yo creo que esa respuesta no la tenemos. Lo que sí sabemos, y creo que esto lo mencionó ahorita Eduardo y también Clavel, Colombia y Venezuela, pues no solamente son países fronterizos, sino que han tenido una historia conjunta en términos económicos, políticos, sociales, culturales, étnicos, raciales y de economías ilegales. Entonces, sin duda alguna, lo que pasa en Venezuela y cómo se lleva a cabo este proceso de transición, si es que se lleva a cabo un proceso de transición, pues va a estar muy relacionado con lo que puede pasar y con el rol que puede jugar Colombia. Esto va a depender también de la reunión que van a sostener Trump y Petro ahorita en febrero. Esto puede también, digamos, depender de los resultados de las elecciones presidenciales que se van a llevar a cabo en mayo y una segunda vuelta en Colombia en junio. Entonces, creo que es difícil decir qué va a pasar. Sabemos que va a tener un impacto. La pregunta es cómo se va a evidenciar este impacto.
Gracias. Tuesday.
Thanks, Felipe. Sorry, I always have to wait for the translator to finish. I mean, I see the tension in the different states in terms of the geopolitical implications of this and how they're reading it and what they're likely to do. But I mean, Venezuela has more neighbors than that and a far reach in terms of its push out of insecurity, instability, and illicit economies. So with your license, I'd like to invite Gabrielle, our Amazon Basin Observatory head, just to give some thought about what some of our countries in your region might be seeing.
Thanks, Tuesday. I think from the perspective of the Amazon, the big threat that we're seeing is kind of a worsening of these convergences between drug trafficking and illicit gold mining in the region. Because we know that, and this is based on ongoing field research that we're undertaking in the Venezuela, Brazil, Guyana tri-border region, that these convergences between drug and gold are arguably the biggest threat posed by organized crime in the Amazon today. And Venezuela is playing a central role in these big drug trafficking organizations becoming directly involved in the drug trade. So managing illicit gold mines, providing security services and demanding extraction from other illicit gold miners, and also moving gold into Venezuela. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon, whereas up to 2 years ago, illicit gold flows were coming out of Venezuela to be exported in Brazil or in Guyana. These flows have now shifted where gold that's illicitly mined in the region, including Guyana and Brazil, is now being sent to Venezuela to be exported overseas, outside of South America to many destinations, including China, UAE, other places. And the current Venezuelan regime is playing a major role in these convergences. So a lot of the buyers on the Venezuelan side that are buying this illicit gold from Brazil and Guyana are Venezuelan military officials, and they're buying gold at a pretty substantial markup price. So higher than international gold prices. So they're basically creating an incentive system for illicit gold mining networks in Brazil and in Guyana, who are ample, massive criminal organizations, to go and sell their assets in Venezuela and not sell their illicit gold in Brazil and Guyana. And this tri-border region of Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana is kind of now becoming this major route, both for gold and increasingly for drugs as well. So for now, the regime mostly remains in place, right? So by all accounts, these same Venezuelan military officials who had been at the forefront of these links are still in place, but we know that the situation is very volatile. And the Amazon, as Pavel, I think, very astutely brought up, is a tinderbox of many different criminal actors and these kind of volatile protection pacts between Venezuelan state officials and criminal groups that are likely to suffer some transformations over the coming months. So we might be seeing greater movement of people across the Venezuela-Brazil border, and maybe an intensification of illicit gold flows and illicit drugs going through this region as well.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I would be remiss if not to go back to Clabel for a second at least to see what she's seeing and feeling in the Amazon too. I know you work very closely with the communities there.
Yeah, until now we have seen like a no major change. As I said before, these groups and people are, especially in the deep south, in the border with Brazil, and that in that region, these collectivos or the armed groups have been called people to stay in calm. They have been used by state actors in the last few years to control population, because this region is increasingly an opposition movement. If you see the results in the last elections in the south of Venezuela, municipalities that have been Chavistas for the last years was highly in the voting for Edmundo Gonzalez. So I remember that when I saw the numbers, I was impressed because I saw like, wow, this is a real change in this region. And they have been not now, they have been operating since I think 10 years ago, because all this started with the organization of cooperativas or gold cooperativas in the South. Chavez intend to organize mining around that idea, and then Delcy Rodriguez and then Maduro switched the idea of how to manage that area. And also with the gold prices and the economic rise and multi-factor system, they look at the South like a way to get money fresh with the traffic of gold to stay in power. But this region have been fighting for many years to have in the beginning for transnationals, and then for the military forces that take the control of this area. So right now is, I think, everything is staying calm. This area, since the interviews that I have last year, the human rights violation were worse, because you have seen many indigenous communities being displaced to Brazil or to some areas. Many of them have been killed. Also, the health situation have been displaced Venezuelans to Brazil, and they have living in the border in these humanitarian refugee camps. They have been pressured because the health situation in the hospitals in the south of Venezuela is very, very difficult. And they have immobilized people displaced people to the south. So we have many factors now, like human rights, the economic crisis, the health situation that have been displaced people, especially to Brazil, to get access to health in that border. And also the institutions, because I remember when all this violence started in the south of Venezuela, I was covering extractive industry. And then we started covering violence, because basically the government state moved specifically actors to the south to control that territory, and to put in place people that just do the job for the government and not by themselves to control this territory. So this started because the government allowed it. The government pushed that to have social control of the population in the south that, as I said, have been increasingly political opposition to the government in the last years.
Thank you, Camille. I feel like from Eduardo's comment, he reminded us about the migration situation. You've really emphasized the humanitarian, the kind of the disenfranchisement, the disengagement with the state. Rebecca, I mean, you've done a lot of work on youth and gangs and the kinds of vectors that play into the kind of appeal of criminality. I mean, not to put words in your mouth, but I'd really like to your analysis of how you think all this might play out in reality for the sort of youth and security and criminal gang situation, and how that's going to go with the US border closed and pressure across the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know just from the start, like we have no idea. Honestly, like anything could happen in the next few months, and I think like we can't repeat that enough. So I'm always hesitant. I've been hesitant. It feels it's been like much longer, but I've been hesitant since the invasion to make any claims about what's going to happen. I mean, I would say, I don't think it's surprising that we've yet seen any, major conflicts or transformations in criminal markets in Venezuela, because I mean, I think, the Trump administration had a very poor understanding, and we don't know if this was something they bought into because they wanted to or because they actually believed it, but had a very poor understanding of the power structure within Chavismo, right? So whether or not let's just take Trump at face value and believe that he actually thought that Maduro ran Tren de Aragua and Cartel de los Soles, right? And actually believed. We know that that's not the case, right? In fact, I mean, Diosdado Cabello and Pedrino Lopez, I think, are much more important actors when we're thinking about who controls larger illicit markets in the country, right? I mean, Maduro was definitely involved in that, but had nowhere near the same power. I mean, this is one of the reasons, not to go too far, I'm going off track from your question, but this is one of the reasons why Maduro spent years trying to consolidate his control on the military when he first came into office, because he didn't have any, right? And so Maduro was not the key figure running, even if something like the Cartel de los Soles did exist, he wouldn't have been the one running it. So I say that to say, this is, I think, one of the reasons why we haven't seen major changes. And because we haven't seen any major changes yet, I assume that this like panorama of gangs and the use that they depend on to continue to operate isn't going to look very different quite yet. I mean, I think Cecilia mentioned this already. I would not be surprised, and it most likely will happen, I think, in the next few months, that we'll start to see more conflict between these gangs, because I think it's also really important to note The Venezuela's criminal landscape is largely defined by small actors, right? By disorganized small actors. We've been talking a lot about these large organizations, but the large majority of actors in the country that are engaged in criminal activities are much smaller groups, right? And what we know, I think, as Cecilia mentioned, what we know from the scholarship is that when there's alteration, or disruption in criminal markets, that tends to produce conflict between these smaller gangs, right? And so I think it's very likely, in the coming months that we'll see, it's not apparent yet that what the United States wants out of Venezuela is going to necessarily affect yet the military's economic interests. It might, but that's just not clear. But I think it's very safe to say that in the coming months we will see much higher rates of violence between young men in Venezuela who are caught up in gangs, right? So I think we will see, because of the destabilization of markets, and also this is still to a certain degree will create some power vacuums in certain places, right? And so that opens the opportunity for gangs to expand their control over markets and territory. And so I think they'll be engaging in that over the next few months. So I think I would say, the overall effect is going to be a very violent, unfortunately lethal and violent effect, on youth gangs, most likely, and also probably between police forces that are competing with youth gangs to control that territory as well, right?
Thank you, Rebecca. And I really appreciate all our panelists acknowledging that a lot of this is like, we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen because anything can happen at this point. But there are things we know about how organized crime works and has worked in the past. And that's why we want to look also at the region, because whatever happens in Venezuela is going to affect Brazil, Colombia, and of course, the Caribbean region. And now I want to go back to the Caribbean and ask you, Roman, what are we seeing there? People were talking about increased movements in the borders, more gang activity. Have we seen any effects in the Caribbean criminal dynamics after Venezuela or before the extradition of Maduro?
Thank you very much. I think what we've seen in the initial video at the beginning of the event was interesting, right? Like the US strikes over the past 6-7 months against go-fast boats allegedly transporting cocaine from the Venezuelan coast towards the US. This was the backbone narrative behind like the intensification of the militarization of the region, and of course the Caribbean Sea in the past 6-7 months. Our research in Colombia, Venezuela, and the Caribbean in recent months has shown that these go-fast boats, as well as slower vessels, such as bulk carriers, fishing boats, are indeed used to smuggle cocaine from the Venezuelan coast, among other incoming destinations, to various other destinations in the Caribbean, starting, of course, with Trinidad and Tobago, for example, a few dozen kilometers away from Venezuela, and we're working on it as far as Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and other destinations in the West Indies. And that's of course an important mention in that debate, the end destination of the immense majority of that cocaine being Europe and not the United States. The strikes disrupted the networks in the Caribbean. I mean, we've heard of it. It's been documented in the press. We've been conducting interviews that confirmed it. There's been an impact on cocaine trafficking in the Caribbean after the strikes. And we can assume that those networks have surely reorganized themselves to move the cocaine in other ways. We can also imagine that trafficking will resume if, for example, the US strikes don't go on forever. But above all, I think it's necessary to carefully study the disruptions within the Venezuelan territory, with actors maybe eager to take greater control over cocaine trafficking or to launch or relaunch new routes, old routes in the Caribbean. The second issue for the Caribbean is, with no doubt, the illicit trafficking of firearms from Venezuela, whether it is illicit trafficking of firearms in the hands of civilians or military stocks. In recent years, several reports have shown evidence of firearms trafficking from Venezuela, again to Haiti, for example, the Dominican Republic, the islands neighboring Venezuela, and even the French West Indies, where we have conducted field work in 2025.
given the crisis in the country and the moment in Venezuela, we have to think of the power of the arms trafficking network that could be taking the opportunity of the disruption to start, making more money, new money out of trafficking illicit firearms. Haiti could be, for example, an attractive destination for Venezuelan networks. 3 years ago, a stockpile of weapons and ammunition was seized in Haiti, and it was proven that it was coming from Venezuela. Here again, and just to finish, the potential instability generated by Maduro's capture could push certain actors to engage in arms trafficking, including the diverting of military stocks. This is a huge concern for Caribbean countries, but also, of course, for other South American countries that we've been mentioning here. And finally, and just to conclude, I would say that Maduro's capture is the latest very disruptive factor in a region, the Caribbean basin, already extremely fragile due to criminal networks and cocaine and firearms trafficking in recent years. And these dynamics will need to be monitored very, very closely now.
And can I just add really quickly? I think it's probably clear for people who are familiar with the boats that were being described, but the shipments that are coming from Venezuela to the Caribbean, it's a very small amount. I mean, I just want to highlight that, particularly as someone from the United States that has sold this narrative that this was about combating narco trafficking. I mean, this is incredibly small amount of drugs, in the large scheme of things. So, it's absolutely true that people use these routes for drug trafficking, but it's such a minor amount. And I think that's important to note to contradict this narrative that the Trump administration has been selling for a long time.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was actually exactly the question we were going to ask after that. So please, thank you. Cecilia, please go ahead.
No, just to add quickly to what Rebecca was saying, also that fentanyl and synthetic opioids are the ones largely responsible for overdose deaths in the US, not cocaine. And so also just to put that into perspective, and there's no evidence to date that there is fentanyl production or trafficking from Venezuela to the US. So also again, to nuance this conversation around drug trafficking and what is causing excess mortality also in North America.
Thanks, Cecilia. Roman, before we leave the Caribbean, there was a question in the very busy chats of the Q&A, so people, please keep your questions coming. They're excellent. Asking whether or not this kind of disruption of the cocaine trafficking flows and overall, I guess, the confidence of criminal groups to operate activities in the Caribbean Sea, how do you see that impacting the organized crime in the Caribbean, the gangs there, and what they may end up doing as a result? I know obviously that you work a lot in Haiti, and Haiti is another massive criminal vector for Latin America that's been high in the headlines recently. Do you see any fallout there?
Yes, I mean, building on what Rebecca said as well, I think although the quantities might be small, what we used to see and what we used to hear in the Caribbean for cocaine traffickers is that any option is valid for cocaine trafficking, right? So you might get small quantities out of Venezuela today, larger quantities out of Colombia tomorrow morning, fishing boats again. Of course, the objective in a way from all those small amounts of cocaine is also to find bigger ports in the Caribbean that can allow you to then containerize larger amounts of cocaine to send it to Europe. And those ports are located in the Dominican Republic and in the French West Indies in that case, also in Jamaica. So in terms of the restructuring of cocaine trafficking in the Caribbean after Maduro's capture, as we have seen in so many other places, the networks will adapt. The networks are unfortunately very resilient, of course, and there's probably tons of other options if cocaine trafficking is disturbed right now from Venezuela. I don't think the traffickers in the Caribbean, unfortunately, will go out of business just because of Maduro's capture. I think what's going to be interesting to follow, and again, this is interesting to follow, and the dozens of islands that surround Venezuela and make for stop and stopping areas in the Caribbean trafficking of cocaine to see what we can document as an impact in the coming month, and see what happens. I think, again, firearms trafficking could be another really important issue because of the stockpiles that are located in Venezuela, and the fact that we've documented and read that, again, like firearms coming from Venezuela have been circulating in the region. On those matters, Haiti is an interesting and probably an attractive location if you want to traffic either cocaine and probably especially, I would say, illicit firearms right now. There is demand for that. There is demand for large amounts of illicit firearms and ammunitions in Haiti. If someone is able to, organize new connections between Haiti and Venezuela on firearms trafficking, I'm sure we will end up finding that ammunitions and firearms will end up in Haiti, which is, of course, a massive concern, I would say. And just to conclude, a more political impact of the Venezuelan crisis on the resolution of the Haitian crisis are the upcoming discussions at the Security Council in New York on the gang suppression force, the new upcoming UN multilateral force supposed to be deployed in 2026 in Haiti. At the Security Council, you have a number of Latin American and South American states that currently have very tense relationships with the Trump administration and that have shown interest in the past to support the deployment of a UN multilateral force in Haiti and to contribute to the resolution of the crisis. I think it's going to be interesting to monitor as well what happens at the Security Council within the relationship between those countries and the US and the Haitian crisis in the middle, of course.
Eduardo, I saw that your hands up, but first, because you were just mentioning, alliances, other countries, and the reaction. And Cecilia, you mentioned fentanyl, and I couldn't wait to ask about Mexico because this is another big relationship of the United States. It also the threat has come to Mexico as well. You were saying that the biggest threat actually to the United States is fentanyl, and that has been quite a diplomatic conversation going on. What has been the effect of these Venezuela events in Mexico thus far? Has that affected anything at all? Can you see any changes on the criminal dynamics? We know that there are Mexican gangs possibly also operating in Venezuela. What's your reading from Mexico?
I think it's important to take a step back and realize that Mexico has been in the naughty list of the Trump administration for a long time, right? So even during the first Trump administration, Mexico was framed not necessarily as a cooperative partner, but rather sort of like a problem south of the border and something that needed to be dealt with. In that context, what we have seen, especially the Sheinbaum administration, is really depart from what the López Obrador administration did. And so this is a silent break. She's not advertising that she has taken a different course, but the attitude of Mexico vis-a-vis fentanyl, for instance, has changed dramatically. President Sheinbaum has talked about how she doesn't want anyone dying from overdoses in any country, which is a very different discourse from López Obrador, who talked about how fentanyl was a US-only problem. And we have seen a lot of cooperation on security happen again. I think it's noteworthy that the day before the first strike in the Caribbean, Secretary Rubio was in Mexico, and this high-level implementation group between Mexico and the US was announced to tackle shared challenges, in which firearms trafficking was included. And this is important because it tells you that Mexico is able to also place on that agenda issues that are important for the country and that there is an ongoing dialogue. President Sheinbaum, unlike Colombia, and Eduardo, feel free to jump in on this as well, has also opted for using diplomatic channels to guide the relationship rather than having a relationship on social media. There's no discussion, there's no spats that happen over social media at all. And what we have seen is recently there was a call. Mexico condemned the attacks in Venezuela, and what we have seen is, again, a discourse emphasizing the productive relationship. The US ambassador to Mexico called the relationship said that it's in the best state it has been in many years. And, while I understand sometimes government press releases are not the most thrilling things to read, I do think it's important to understand how the US is characterizing that relationship with Mexico. So right now, Mexico, what it's doing is managing and trying to avoid, of course, a strike in the country. And so it will be very important to watch what Mexico continues to do to offer what the US calls tangible results. We have seen the so-called transfer of prisoners, so not quite extraditions, because they did not use the extradition treaty to transfer these prisoners from Mexico to the US. And so it will be interesting to track what Mexico will continue to offer. But we have seen, again, an emphasis on managing that relationship, on reactivating security cooperation. And so far, we have seen that both countries seem to be satisfied with how it has been managed until now. But of course, a concern for Mexico to continue to manage, how the US feels about what they call narco-terrorists in the country, which again, Mexico does not recognize that designation.
Yes, super concerning, Cecilia, but definitely something to watch because it is going to be evolving. Sorry, Eduardo, I'm coming back to you. And I know you wanted to add something. I don't know if you forgot or not. I hope not, but I also have a question from the audience that I'm going to give back to you because you have been looking at these conflicts in the border. And somebody from our audience wants to know about the weapons that are, at the hands of the militias, the colectivos, and how can this affect disputes between countries in the region? And should this massive amount of weapons going on in the hands of different criminal actors should be something concerning?
Well, I just wanted to take a step back further, just for a little. When you asked me about the situation at the border between Colombia and Venezuela, first of all, I would say that it's the largest Colombian border. And even if we can find along the border very similar challenges in terms of security at the transborder level, I do think that we can narrow from my point of view, two strategic areas of concern in the Colombian border with Venezuela. First of all, I would say the Catatumbo region. The Catatumbo region is located in Norte de Santander. And why is this important? It's important because the Catatumbo region is like a hotspot of coca crops. And it has been so for many years. I mean, as it has been documented, for instance, by the United Nations Office United Nations Office Against Drug and Crime report have had as hotspots, so to speak, El Catatumbo in the border with Venezuela, and that's not something recent. It has been going on for a long years, and in the Putumayo region in the border with Ecuador and Peru. And a second point or a second area is the region of Arauca. And more in the south, the region of Arauca borders the provincia de el estado de Apure in Venezuela. Just a little bit to be a little bit more specific, seems like very broad. And it's a very, large border, but with many differences. And to the question in terms of the audience, what is interesting is that, as I mentioned before, it's not the first time that Colombian armed actors are present in the border or have crossed the border. The main and the most, the contrast, you could make like a parallel between the government of Santos Calderon and the FARC-EP while Hugo Chavez was in power, and the ELN and Gustavo Petro with Nicolás Maduro while he was in power. But the parallel stops there. Why? Because the FARC-EP were a very had a very vertical structure in terms of command and control, in contrast with the ELN, in terms that the structure of the ELN is sets more loose. They speak of like it's more like a federation. And of course, right now, the security landscape, the security panorama in Colombia, none of the armed groups involved in the paz total of President Gustavo Petro has like a strategic interest in terms of reaching out power at the national level. So what we have been is that there are like regional clusters. In the case of the ELN with the border of Venezuela, clearly. And what I want to say is that there is like a strong criminalization. I don't want to fall into the Paul Collier's argument. There are everything like nexus with the political realm, but also, and now to answer the question of the audience, what is interesting is that there is like a very wide portfolio of criminal activities. So for instance, with two of my colleagues from Externado de Colombia University, Irene Cabrera and Andres Macias, we were able to do research in the southern border of Colombia with Ecuador and Peru. And what we see is that all these illicit markets are in a certain way intertwined. I mean, you don't have like on one hand, I don't know, cocaine going out, on the other hand, arms trafficking getting in. But I mean, it's all, let's say, like a supply and demand. So I would say that in terms of like a policy recommendation, which is easier to say it than to do, it's to bear in mind that these are like criminal markets really interconnected, and criminal actors that may have, for instance, a participation in terms of drug trafficking, but also in terms of migrant traffics. And just to add a little bit, to previous discussion regarding extradition that was mentioned before, and Cecilia mentioned, or I don't remember, one of our colleagues, Colombia has like a lot of evidence. For instance, when the leaders of paramilitary groups during the Uribe Vélez government were extradited to the United States, they were only charged in terms of drug trafficking. But what happens to all the human rights violation, and what will happen with Nicolás Maduro and the record, for instance, of human rights violations in terms of civil liberties being eroded? And also, it's very interesting from what I've been hearing from Cecilia and from my colleague from the University of Florida. I mean, it's clearly a case of threat inflation in terms of what has been going on. And last but not least, I mean, this is definitely like Latin America and the Caribbean, and particularly Colombia, we are witnessing first row how like this new global order is taking place. And I just want to say that how does this change our understanding of borders? No, in terms that I do not think that, and it's like an open question, not easy to answer, in terms like the previous assumptions we held regarding borders, I do think that they need to be revisited.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Sorry, I feel like, we have so much expertise in the table and everybody actually has a lot to say, and we thought 90 minutes would be too long, and now we're running out of time, and it's a tragedy. This is a very rich topic. We will, out of this webinar and plus our research, be releasing a summary and a report, and we will try to answer some of the questions that have continued to build up in the chat, since there are many, many good ones. Clavel, I see your hand up. I was just going to ask Felipe to give me a 2-second answer. Okay, maybe not 2 seconds, 2 minute long answer to this one question being asked about a union between Colombian armed groups to defend themselves from a threat from the US, which I think picks up on some of Eduardo's earlier comments and other discussions. So short, please, and then Clavel, the floor is yours after that.
Gracias, Tuesday. Y creo que se relaciona también con la pregunta de los colectivos. Y aquí voy a hacer futurología porque es imposible decir con certeza qué va a pasar, pero podemos poner escenarios. Creo que por una parte, y voy a arrancar por los colectivos para luego moverme a Colombia, creo que por una parte tenemos civiles armados en Venezuela listos para defender un régimen político. Si llega el momento y es el llamado de parte de las fuerzas militares o de parte del gobierno, de algunas personas que quedan en el gobierno que muy bien Clavel mencionó ahorita. Pero al mismo tiempo tenemos personas armadas que en un vacío de poder pueden empezar a explotar economías ilícitas a nivel local y a nivel urbano, en lo que Rebeca llamaba esta lógica desordenada de funcionamiento de los grupos criminales en Venezuela. Entonces, creo que los colectivos presentan una amenaza, primero de la posibilidad de generar un conflicto armado interno, ocasionalmente, si no se da una transición, y segundo, de explotar economías criminales a nivel local. Y creo que algo similar puede pasar del otro lado de la frontera, ¿no? Al romper este equilibrio, y era una pregunta que habían hecho, digamos, hace rato, al romper este equilibrio que hay entre los actores integrados al Estado y los grupos criminales venezolanos, del lado colombiano de la frontera también se genera, digamos, una tensión o como un cambio de estructura y de acuerdos, especialmente entre dos grupos, el ELN, que está hacia el lado del Catatumbo que mencionaba Eduardo, y las disidencias de las FARC que operan más hacia el lado eh, colombiano. Y frente a la pregunta de una posible unión, pues creo que muchos de estos grupos han sido designados también como organizaciones narcoterroristas por parte del gobierno de los Estados Unidos y esto genera, digamos, como un potencial ataque directo hacia ellos y podría darse un ejercicio de defensa por parte de estos grupos si llegara a haber una acción en el lado colombiano. La pregunta es qué tan viable es una acción en el lado colombiano en este momento. Yo tengo mis dudas, pero pues también, insisto, estamos haciendo futurología. Y cerraría tu pregunta, Tuesday, hablando del caso específico del ELN, que creo que es el actor que juega en los dos lados de la frontera. Y creo que el ELN puede tener un rol de autodefensa de la mano con estos colectivos y de generar un poco un conflicto armado interno de largo aliento, soportado y financiado por la existencia de economías ilícitas, pero por otra parte también una apuesta más agresiva de reorganización y de ocupar espacios criminales en el lado de la frontera, como ya lo hicieron en el Catatumbo, atacando a las disidencias de las FARC y buscando moverse hacia el sur, hacia Arauca. Y esto sin duda alguna generaría un aumento en la violencia y en el impacto humanitario en Colombia.
I think Tuesday is waiting for the translation.
No,
But
I'm not. Well, yeah, okay, yeah. But Clavel, you had your hand up before. Is there something up following on from Felipe's point you wanted to add now?
Yeah, about the transition, the democratic transition that I think that is very important in this discussion, because I'm wondering, and I know someone have asked, all of this look at like a disaster in the South and in Venezuela, many groups arms, and people maybe are wondering like, okay, how this gonna be like reinstitutionalized in Venezuela if all these groups are operating there. And I think pushing for democratic elections is a very important step, of course, as many NGOs and leaders have been said, because from my perspective in the south of Venezuela, all of this started because the government started the erosion of the democracy, attacking the unions that control this industry. For example, in the gold minings, we have a corporation, a state corporation that control the area in the south of Venezuela. When we was starting seeing these violent groups, it's because the state displaced this corporation state that have been operating since the democracy started in Venezuela and put it and divided in different groups and military, and they incorporate many another actors, displace their own state, the government displays their own state by these groups. So, and also the elections in 2017, the first election that they stole was in the Bolivar state in the south of Venezuela because they lose. And there was proof that they lose, and it has in the court right now that has never resolved that situation, but it is starting there. So I feel I'm a little bit optimistic because with the result of what the democratic elections and a free election and fair elections can happen in Venezuela, because many things can be organized in this with that point for a start with elections, because we have seen, and also in the border with Brazil, they just remove the authorities, the legal authorities that have been elected for another government to control the area. So when that happened, I want to see what happened when the elections happened in Venezuela with free and fair, how these the reinstitution of Venezuela can be developed in that order, how these groups, armed groups, are going to react to that, because as I already said, they have been there because the government allowed them to stay there, and that probably will have a reorganization, a different monopoly are going to start. But I'm very curious about that results and how, of course, the unions in the south of Venezuela were a very powerful force, and the government just put many of them in jail, and some of them are in exile. They control the iron industry, another gold mining. They control it. They organize the workers around that. Thousands of workers that depend of the corporation state that right now they are not producing anything. That it's part of the humanitarian crisis. So I think that when that happens, we can see a reinstitutionalization of the state in the south of Venezuela and in many places, because someone asked about what is happening with the oil industry. And if you see the result of the oil industry, the unions, for example, that was a force to be accountability, to do some kind of accountability to the oil industry, many of them are in jail. Leaders that were Chavistas are in jail, and people are fighting for them to be released. So we need different things that happen right now to see a quickly recovery of not only the democracy, but about the democracy means that is the participation of many actors. And I want to put the point of the civil organizations in Venezuela, because I think civil society in Venezuela is very well organized, and they have been able to document many violations of human rights. And we are in this point in the criminal court, for example, because that work, and it's a very important actor that I think in many discussions have been like displayed, like, oh, this is just Venezuelan as Maria Corina and Delcy Rodriguez. But allow this, we have the universities, we have the NGOs, we have people working in many states documenting the situation and pushing for a democratic transition, and a point to start is free elections in Venezuela. And we have, with that point to start, we have, I think we can have another conversation then when that happens, hopefully soon, that how these actors are going to be to transform, how they are being to align to different actors now.
Thank you, Clavel. You saved us on a number of topics there. There were questions around oil and its injection into, with the US control and changing production, how that might change the political economy. And there are a number of questions, I think, that look at that. As we have 5 minutes left, I'm going to put a horrible challenge to all of our participants, all of our panelists, just to basically tell me in a few words, please, the issue and I think with the spirit that all of us want to see a reduction in organized crime, all of us want to see a reduction in violence and a reinstitution of the rule of law in Venezuela and the region as a whole. For you, what is the one issue that you think we can't take our eye off? So what do we absolutely have to pay attention to in the next weeks and months as the fallout of this extraction takes place? What must we pay attention to? I'll let our guests think first, since they are our guests, and I will start with my colleagues. Roma, do you want to go first?
Thank you. Very, very quickly, again, just to put our attention onto the Caribbean, a region that has been extremely unstable over the past couple of years, largely under researched and underreported for some time. And I think we need to monitor what are going to be the consequences of the crisis in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you, Roma. I'll go next to Gabriel.
Yeah, I think the intersections between drugs, gold, and now potentially oil as well. I think going back to the question that you brought up Tuesday, we see this in Brazil already, where the PCC is heavily involved in fuel smuggling. And there's also precedent in the region of the ELN attacking oil pipelines as well in Colombia. So there's every prospect of similar dynamics coming into play in Venezuela, particularly as we're seeing the larger criminal groups in the region now generating a lot of revenue from the illicit gold trade over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think we're going to start to see the effects of that, their kind of cash-heavy approach now, their ability to exert coercion in this kind of strange power vacuum that's likely to emerge in Venezuela. I think that's kind of a major threat. And just if I can add just another quick one would be, we're seeing is the Brazilian criminal groups, the PCC and the Comando Vermelho, expanding aggressively throughout the Amazon, but they haven't expanded into Venezuela so far. So something that I'm particularly curious to watch out for is whether we're going to see PCC or CV or both operating in Venezuela now as well.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And always nice to have a scary ending to the to the discussion. Felipe.
I think I will focus in what will be the consequence of this new equilibrium in the Venezuela regime regarding the relationship with other criminal groups. So they had a fragile but functioning order that now is broken. So what will be this new alignment will tell us what will happen also with organized criminal groups, not only in Venezuela, but in the region, particularly for the case of Colombian and Brazilian groups.
Thank you, Felipe. Cecilia, what must we watch?
I think just to add to the cheery note that my colleagues have shared, I think as we see these actions unfold, if we're going to start having very lethal conflicts that are contained, I'm thinking, for instance, of Sinaloa, Syria, your homeland, and thinking about, Zambada's also extraction from Sinaloa that he calls a kidnap and the fallout from that, right? And now we have very high levels of violence in the state, homicide, but other types of violence that have resulted precisely as the infighting continues. And so now with Venezuela, taking note, of course, of what Rebecca said, that we can't predict what will happen. But if you're going to start to see, again, very high levels of lethality in the region where you remove, people from criminal structures in this manner instead of, finding other paths to preclude this criminal activity. So, just a cheery thought for us going forward.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Cecilia. And then finally, I turn to our guests. So a big thank you, Eduardo, for joining us today. What is the takeaway you'd like our audience to not take their eyes off moving forward?
Well, I would say at the level of the border between Colombia and Venezuela, whether or not there are disputes around key criminal hotspots, such as in the Catatumbo, because I would think that this will reveal the extent of Nicolas Maduro alleged control, of all the criminal activities. It's kind of like a natural experiment, and also will allow us to check at the local level, the level of autonomy and leverage of criminal actors with local authorities, civilian populations, and so on.
Thank you, Eduardo. Sobering also. Clavel, final word to you. Thank you for all your insights and thank you for joining us. What's the issue to watch?
Freedom expression, I would say, because I know many actors before the extraction of Maduro, they were pushing, many economic actors pushing a scenario like China, and we have many open economy, more open economy, but with less freedom that we have now. So I think freedom expression could be an indicator especially in the regions where we don't have right now many journalists working putting their faces because it's dangerous. So I think it could be an indicator of how things are going and how what is allowed to report and what is not allowed to report, and what is the interest of the government to the foreign government to highlight and what they are trying to hide and pushing people that don't talk about that. So I think that is I put an eye on that too.
Gracias, Clavel. And I like what you said about that it's important to remember that there's a strong civil society in Venezuela. And I like what you say that freedom of expression is something to watch out. The quality of the information and what we know is going to be essential to understand this problem and to produce good responses. So thank you all for committing to that. It has been a wonderful experience getting to know more about the situation with you all, and thank you all for all of you who stayed and watched the whole thing. It was such a pleasure. Thank you and goodbye.